Hello, this is Martin Willis. Welcome to the show. Every year it seems to cause a problem with the daylight savings time thing, and that's what happened today with our guest. They don't change that over in England, and so it all got messed up. And luckily, I was able to reach him. So we're about 20 minutes late. It's not that. It could have been much worse. Could have been a whole hour. So here we are with our guest, Mark Olly, and he has studied these ancient crystal skulls and human heads, but he's also done all kinds of things. And we're going to be talking about that. He's a fascinating, I've listened to a show where he was on a fascinating guest. So I'm really looking forward to this. And I have kind of a crystal skull story I want to talk to him about as we go along. So this is the Everything Else show. And every single time I do one of these Everything Else shows, someone puts in the comment down below, well, nothing about UFOs. Well, guess what? He has some stories about UFOs or some connection to UFOs. We're going to touch on that too. So you can't say that this time. So here he is. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Eventually.
Yeah. Well, that's all right. I'm so glad because the U.S. is let's see, I think it's the fall this coming year is the last time we're going to do a daylight savings time, and I'm thrilled about it. I talked to a friend and she was upset, saying, "No, I get up early in the morning and walk." And it's, well, you know what? She'll just have to sleep in a little bit. That's all. Yep. So yeah, it always messes everything up. So I'm really glad we're not doing that anymore. But thank you so much for joining the show tonight. And I want to tell you, I know we're going to be talking about all kinds of things, but I went to Expo 67 in Quebec, Canada, about 10, 15 years after. I went up with a friend. We went up on motorcycles when I used to do that years ago. And I remember going through Expo 67, and in some room we went into, and there was an ancient skull, and it said it could be 5,000, crystal skull, could be 5,000 years old. They didn't know, from Central America. And I was mesmerized. I remember, of all the things that I looked at that day, that moved me the most when I thought, wow, this thing could be over 1,000 years old. So humans have always had a fascination with the head and the skull, right? I mean, yeah. So let's hear a little bit first about your background and what got you interested in the topic.
Okay. Well, essentially, I'm an archaeologist. It's what I've been for many years. It's what I do professionally. So obviously, I'm interested in old things, and there's an awful lot of skulls out there that are old. If you wanted to take something that was common probably to every time period that we have evidence for, it would be a skull. So I came up with the idea under lockdown, when we had the whole COVID thing, of going back in time and looking at all these different skulls and using that as a thread to examine what humans were up to and their belief systems and what they were doing in the past. And it's proven to be really revealing, very, very revealing. I extended it a little bit into images of the human skull and the human head. And I've got a crystal skull of my own as well. I acquired one. Mine's nowhere near as old as 10,000 years. It's probably just pre-Columbian. It's probably maybe 500 to 700 years, somewhere in that bracket.
Now, let me just ask you this before we move on from that. From what you're saying right now, is I understand, because I'm an appraiser, but I understand you can easily date things like pottery and wood and things like that. But when it comes to stone and crystal, you can never age that as far as when humans intervened with it. So do you just use like the machinery used? I mean, the tools used? How do you date a crystal skull?
Yeah, if you find yourself confronted with a crystal skull, the obvious thing to do is look at it for evidence of machine manufacture. If there's any kind of machine, any kind of turning lathes, cutters, sanders, whatever, even sandpaper, very often, if you end up looking at these things, you will find some kind of manufacturing marks, which essentially is what they've done with various skulls at the British Museum and other skulls around the world. And a lot of these have got what they say are 19th century tool marks. But then if you'll also look at them and they're handmade, not obviously machine made, then somebody has taken an awful lot of trouble to select the right crystal, to make the right features, to produce something of great beauty and obviously great importance. So the one I've got is handmade, it's highly polished, and as far as we can tell, there are very few marks on it at all. I mean, if you went to look at something like the Mitchell Hedges skull, that has been looked at under electron microscopy. I nearly said that. And there are no marks. They can't find any marks on that at all. So you're then faced with the obvious conclusion that somebody venerated this thing, handled it for a long period of time. Whoever manufactured it then went to great pains to get rid of all the marks off it. And that takes a long time. That's generation after generation after generation of people handling it, sanding it, working with it. And then, of course, the most important thing is if you've actually got any kind of evidence of where it came from. And I happen to know that sort of 2 owners back, mine originated in South America, so it comes from the right place, and it comes from the Mayans, if truth be known. And the crystal, you can type the crystal, you can analyze it to find out where elsewhere in the world that particular type of crystal is found, and mine's South American. So there are ways of narrowing it down. There's no absolute. There's a new technique for dating stone that looks at moisture in stone and moisture loss.
I see.
But that's still in development, and obviously it's quite expensive, so I've not really had that done on mine. But you can only be reasonably confident. I suppose you could say you could be 75-80% confident what's real and what isn't real, and there's an awful lot of ones that are definitely not real knocking around out there at the moment.
Yeah, right. Here I was just a few weeks ago, right at the I was in Belize and down in at the Mayan ruins. So anyway, I wanted you to continue, but before you do, you talked about your skull being about 500 years old or somewhere around there. Do you have that handy where you can just grab it and pick it up in front of the camera, or is that
no, it's in storage. It's in storage.
Okay.
I'll tell you what, though,
it's ahead of the show, but
no, it's a good opportunity for a plug because it actually appears in the book which I've just written, Crystal Skulls and Human Heads. So if folks actually want to see it, there's a whopping great big photo of mine in there, so you could see that.
Yeah, and that's by Flying Disc Press.
Flying Disc
Philip
Press.
Mantle, a great friend of this show, and I believe he's watching right now.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Well, it was Philip that sort of gave me a nudge and went, "They're waiting for you. They're waiting for the interview." You know, and I'm like, "Oh!"
That's right.
So thanks to Philip for getting the ball rolling.
That's right. So all right. So I want you to continue along. You have this 500-year-old skull. Did you acquire it before you got interested in the topic, or was this something you looked for once you got interested in the topic?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I actually started getting interested in the topic as long ago as a 1970s series that we had over here called Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World. If anybody gets that book, the thing on the front cover is the Mitchell Hedges skull. So that was my interest. You know, I mean, I'm not as old as I look, but you know, 1970s, I was old enough as a teenager to appreciate what was going on at that time, and I really took an interest in that. And then at the same time as that happening, I was also on an archaeological dig over here where we had somewhere in the order, I think it was about 128 monastic skeletons exposed and excavated. It was the largest monastic dig in Europe at the time. That was Norton Priory. That was up here in the Mersey Valley. I was on that for about 4 or 5 years on and off. So I had a lot of contact, a lot of connections with human remains. I did a few others as well. I've dug in prehistoric sites, and I've done a friary and 1 or 2 other bits and bobs. And you do start to notice differences in human skulls. And then eventually, of course, you start to broaden your horizons. I too have been to South America. I went to Chichen Itza and Coba and 1 or 2 other places. But I never got to see any of the Paracas skulls because it's the Paracas skulls that really nailed it for me. And I've got to shout out to Eric von Daniken for that one because there's an enormous Paracas skull that appears in 1 of his books.
Is that the elongated skulls?
Yeah, the big ones, about 3 times the capacity, the cranial capacity of a normal human being. That just absolutely blew me away. So me being me, while I was under lockdown, just went absolutely bonkers and went off and researched as much as I could possibly find on every single human head you could possibly imagine. And the result is crystal skulls and human heads. I did it as a PowerPoint originally. I mean, I've been doing it sort of on and off as an archaeological presentation for about maybe 8 or 10 years. But to actually get the background to it, bulk up the science, and actually bring it forward as a book, I think it's worked all right. I think it's come out okay. Anyway, that's the plug that Philip wanted for the book in there. Anyway, can't not talk about the book.
That's right. That's right. So there's also been, I have heard this. So there's also been, I don't want to say conspiracies, but there's been thoughts that there's something more going on with these skulls than just skulls. Have you? Yes. Yeah. Can you talk about some of the mythology on that?
Well, it's gone a bit beyond mythology. We're at the stage now. What struck me is that some guys over here in the UK have found a way of writing data in 5 dimensions into glass on a glass disc. It's not something you can read at home. It's something they do with their laboratory gear. But they know they can write this stuff, and the terabyte ability of these discs is absolutely phenomenal. They're huge. They're about, I don't know, 30 times what you'd find on a normal CD. But they're written into glass. Glass is silicon. Quartz is silicon. That's what it is. Yep. So there's always been this thing going around that, when the 13 like big skulls all get brought together that are all ancient, and they'll unite, and all this information will come out, and a lot of the science and community and history community are like, I don't really see how that's going to be possible. But now, if we had the ability to be able to read quartz and read quartz silica, we'd be able to get some form of data back out of it. I'm amazed nobody's actually trying it at the moment. Somebody should be having a go at it with the developments. I think it's Southampton University that came up with this disc, and they should be looking at the idea of maybe taking that further. But then the more you look into that, the more you look into silicon and what have you, we're carbon-based life forms and all the rest of it, but we're essentially living in a silicon world. Everything around us seems to revolve around silica. So you've got, glass in your windows, you've got microchips in your computers, you've got, once you start to think about what's got that melted sand in it, the crystal aspect of it starts to take on a sort of a story of its own. I mean, the actual subtitle to the Crystal Skulls and Human Heads is The Mystical History of Glass and the End of the World, because somewhere hidden in that mystery is the beginning of the world, is the world we live in now, and also the end of the world we live in now, whenever that comes. And it's not going to happen tomorrow. Don't worry about it. Don't panic. So that was sort of what I was looking at. And one of the things that, just as a matter of trivia, that happened to come out, I was looking at, well, what part does silica play in us, and then I discovered that if you're deficient when you're developing, the thing that comes out wrong, if you like, at the end because of silica deficiency is the brain. So you're like, whoa, hold on a minute. That's it. That's the connection. That's the silica, the crystal, is required for a human being that's developing to build its brain. That's absolutely mind-blowing. How on earth did they know that when they started banging out these crystal heads? So they're making correct representations of the correct substance in the correct way, but they're doing it before they had the technology to really appreciate that. So it's little gems like that. The book's just peppered with things like that. And I know people are going to get hold of it. It's not an enormously long book, and it's very easy to read. But it's one of those things where you're going to have sort of a wow moment, a sort of mini revelation on every page. And that was the kind of journey I was having. I think the other important one as well was there's been a lot of debate over whether the human skulls are stretched, whether they're artificially made bigger, or whether they're naturally that size. And what I discovered is it's actually both. It looks like the natural size ones came first, which is what you'd expect, and they're born that way with these enormous craniums. But then people started copying that because it obviously gave them some kind of advantage, and that advantage was respected and it was encouraged, and then they started copying it. But then sadly, the guys with the enormous heads eventually became extinct. Not all that long ago either. And that seems to be what's happened. So now they've continued to do the elongation. It's still done in certain parts of the world, but it must offer a superior human being at the end of the day. So again, there's a section in the book that looks at the brain and what effect those extra sized craniums would have on the brain. Are they aliens? That's the big question, which everyone's going to ask. And the answer is no, they're not aliens from Mars or Venus or, anywhere else. But are they alien to us? Yes, they are alien to us, because their DNA and their actual physical structure, the structure of these heads, the bone structure, is completely different from us. But that now, again, is not so unusual, because they're coming up with this idea of the Lord of the Rings type world in ancient times, where there were many different varieties of human beings, the same way as there's many different varieties of all species on Earth.
Yeah.
So they're definitely not us.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that answer the question? I hope it does.
Yes, it does. And we have a couple of people posting questions in chat, and thank you for putting that in caps. I'll put that up. We may be able to even take in a half hour or so, maybe able to take a couple of calls. I have my own type of thing, but as well. I'm just wondering, when you were looking into archaeology in general, I mean, your study of it, one of the things I've said or thought about a number of times is it seems like the modern Homo sapiens, as we know them today, seem to develop awful fast. You hear a lot of times in science that we're only like 100,000 years or 200,000-year-old species. Does it seem kind of curious to you that we could develop in that short of a time the way we have? Or is that just me thinking?
It's a very, very good question, because I don't dodge the question in the book. But what I do say in the book is that the whole science of dating and dating periods and time periods is actually a lot more fluid than most people think. It's not literally written in stone that, just because carbon-14 says that it's whatever, that is exactly how old it is. It's fluid. There's a certain amount of fluidity in that. And I'm not entirely convinced that everything evolves one thing after another, after another, after another. There's definite modification and changes in species, and species, react, to fit the environment that they find themselves in. And we do exactly the same thing. But that's not to say that at some point in the distant past, we didn't have the majority of the species alive all at the same time. And that really does muddy the water, because there's a lot of gaps in the chronology. Sometimes, even if you go by the hundreds of thousands of years, you can end up with a gap of 200,000, 300,000 years between the dating on one species and the dating on another. And at the end of the day, it might just be that we don't have a fossil for that, or, we haven't found it yet. That bit's just missing. Or maybe the whole lot was alive all at once, which again is a theory that, since Darwin, people don't seem to have really gone for that. Everyone's like, oh, we can't go down that route. That's creationist. It's biblical and all this, that, and the other. Well, actually, there is a scientific version of it called Panspermia, which is the idea that the planet's seeded and then develops from that. So there's no reason to say that we couldn't all have, sort of come about roughly at the same time, or couldn't have occurred after some form of cataclysmic event, like a meteorite strike or a comet strike or whatever. And then what we're seeing now is that world recovered afterwards. So I don't think we're necessarily a tremendously young species, but I don't think in the past we were the dominant species, not by any means. I think there were human beings that would make us look like, rabbits compared to, these guys with the big heads must have been absolutely incredible. When you imagine that, what the brain's capable of, and all of a sudden someone comes along and goes, guess what? My brain's 3 times bigger than your brain. And you're like, oh, what on earth does that mean? And we look at these fabulous things from the past and we wonder at them in absolute awe. How did they map the planets? How did they move that 300-ton block halfway up a wall? And, we look at all these things. These guys probably just sat there and worked it out. If you've got 10 of them in a room and they've all got supercomputers and they've all got different skills, because we're a varied species, there's no reason why they couldn't work out how to, build a pyramid over a cup of coffee on a Sunday afternoon, because these guys are incredible. They're absolutely amazing. That's another problem with archaeology as well. We wrestle with a lot of difficulties and a lot of mysteries because we have the information missing. It's not there. We're trying to fill in the gaps. And until we have some evidence, that is still going to be not there. So we're trying to work out how things are done and dates and ages and things like that. And the gaps are just thwarting us on every turn. It doesn't always work out that we can work out how something is.
Yeah, I was just recently on a trip. I went to Coral Castle down in Florida, and I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but that is these were giant, several stones worth. I mean, weighed several tons.
Yeah.
That this little guy that weighed 100 pounds somehow moved them, and nobody really knew what was going on. And so there's all kinds of conspiracies about that as well. I had going back to the origin of man as we know us. I had an ex-CIA director, John Ramirez, on here, who claims he went to a meeting at a conference that was put on by someone in the CIA, but it was not classified meeting. It wasn't necessarily open to the public. But during that meeting, the person running the conference was saying that we have been a hybrid so many thousands of years ago from aliens, I think. I want to say that. And surprisingly, he said there were, most of the people who signed in had EDU behind their mailing address. It was a lot of people from, college and universities around the country, I guess, supposedly. And he said nobody got like out of control, upset or anything. They were shaking their heads as if they heard it before, which is really bizarre. Another mystery I'd like to find out a little bit more about.
It's partially true, because there's no doubt that the different species, the distinct forms of humans, right from the little tiny, skeletons found out in the Philippines and things like that, all the way through to the giants of legend or whatever, there's no doubt that at different times, those different species found it necessary to interbreed. Because the analysis in particular that they've done on things like Neanderthal DNA, they've ended up spotting another race in there, which has now become known as the Denisovans. They don't even know what the Denisovan race is. It's just DNA that is not native to the Neanderthals. At the same time, there's a couple of other DNAs now that have popped up, one from the east, another from the west, and that DNA hasn't really been isolated. And then within ourselves, if you went to the Aborigines, they've got the highest current living concentration of Neanderthal DNA. They're somewhere, I think they're about 22 or 23% Neanderthal. So in terms of us being a pure in the true sense species, we're not. We're absolutely definitely not. Science is discovering that we've interbred. Whether any of that DNA has extraterrestrial origin, at the moment, I don't think science has completely established that, not that I'm aware of. So like I say, he's partially correct to say that we're definitely not a pure race. There's another issue as well. There's nothing to say that had we reached a high society and become highly developed thousands of years ago, that let's get biblical. Let's talk in language that people might understand. Supposing in the days before there was a flood, that somebody like Noah's generation had longer to develop their science then than we had to develop our science now. So we've had about 2,000 years to reach where we are. Back then, pre-flood, they had about 3,000 years. So then that raises a question, what would they have known? What would their understanding have been of genetics and DNA? How would they have approached that? What priorities would they have given, and how would they have done that in a different way? Some people would go even further. I mean, if you want to go all the way back to some of the Babylonian records and 7,500 to 10,000 BC, Egyptian records, we know they started at about 12,000 BC, and they had stuff going further back than that. None of it's really survived, not in a form we can follow. But it means that there have been other races of humans, certainly in the thousands of years, that could have had chance to significantly alter the way that we are now. So I'm not ruling it out. I wouldn't rule out that DNA of some kind could have been added to us from elsewhere, because we're doing the old mix and match thing ourselves now. So
that's right. It's fascinating. I had Dr. Gary Nolan from Stanford University, professor there, in this same line of study. He was on recently, and during the show, he talked about about life. Let's see, it's basically linear regression of genetic complexity, going all the way back to 9.7, give or take 2.5 billion years, which is pretty bizarre if you think about it, considering the Earth is only 4 point something billion years old.
Yeah.
So another explainable. There's a white paper on that. It's fascinating. All this stuff fascinates me.
But in a sense, I'm on the one hand, I've got the scientific side of me, which definitely follows the science. But there's another side of me, because I, as a writer, try to communicate to the public. So sometimes I play devil's advocate. So playing devil's advocate, I would love to know what system he's using to get his dates. Because if he came on, that's a question I'd love to ask somebody like that and say, how are you establishing the dates? It's going to be something to do with rate of decay, or, you know, amount of radiation, or some of the content of whatever it is he's analyzing. It'll be in there somewhere, but I'd love to know exactly how he's doing it. Because I do struggle, and I presume an awful lot of your listeners will struggle as well with these enormous figures, absolutely catastrophically large figures, which, to be honest with you, the guys with the giant heads probably got their heads around that kind of number, but to most people, you know what I mean? I'm going
to send the white paper to you. It's 26 pages long, and I will send that to you. So you can
be delighted to have a look.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly where it was published, but I know it's in there. Anyway,
And I was going to say, and then at some point, I'll probably come back on again in the future and try and translate it so that people will understand why he's right, because that seems to be my job.
Here's a question for you, going back to the crystal skulls. Can you tell us how many confirmed crystal skulls have been found? And he also puts down there, I know some have proven to be hoaxes. Yes, I've heard about those too.
Right, there's an official and there's an unofficial answer to that. The official answer to it, are you ready for this, is two. That's all there is.
Whoa.
That's all there is. And one of them is tiny. The reason I say that is that archaeologists are absolute sticklers, and if it's not in an archaeological context and it's not recorded and you can't say that's where I found it, then they will say it's not real. Now, I know this too, because there's one in the ballpark at Coba, in the floor of the ballpark set there. You can actually see it. It's a white quartz one. And there was another one that came from some Aztec ruins not far from Mexico.
Is this the white quartz one right here? I mean...
No, you won't. The one in the ballpark, again, you'd have to buy the book, my book, to see it, because I've not seen any photos of it online. That's it.
There's your book right there.
Dash out and buy that, because there's a photo of it in there. So if I'm taking the party line, if I'm being official, then the answer's 2. If you want to look at how many are claimed to be true before mass production, and I really do say before mass production, the ones that have filtered out into the museums, so the British Museum, the ones in Paris, the Mitchell Hedges skull, etc., there's around about 8 or 10 of them, depending on who you read and you know, who you believe. In private hands, there may be another 2 or 3, because I've got one. So I certainly don't think there's more than maybe about 13 or 14 of them, where you can look at the skull and go, that has got documentary evidence going back to the guy that, you know, whatever, gave it to museum, sold it, did whatever. It would have to go back to the first half of the 1800s, really. You'd have to go back to the beginning of the 19th century to be able to say that they weren't mass producing these things. So nowadays, it's almost impossible now to know where they're coming from, unless they're coming out of an archaeological context. Very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you can buy them. You can order one online.
Yep. Yeah.
So, and it's not going to be an ancient one, I guarantee you that.
I was looking at a box of about 200 of them, thumb size, the size of the end of your thumb.
Oh, yes.
So obviously sat there and carved them all, and you know, so it's got crazy. It's gone crazy now.
Right. I think you answered this, but I'm going to put it up here anyway. Has there been any multispectral analysis of skulls, particularly in the older and more extraordinary ones. Has any measured effect been measured?
Again, all I can tell you is what I could discover. I could discover that one or two of them have had Kirlian photography done on them to have a look at the energy that the quartz is producing. Now, as far as science is concerned, the energy, the electricity that quartz puts out is a known phenomenon. It's a known factor.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're seeing on Kirlian photography is real. You know, it's definitely there. It's genuine. In terms of multispectral analysis, I'm not really sure what you'd get back other than the impurities inside the quartz silica that forms the quartz, because it's clear quartz. So you'd get all kinds of different readings. As I say, most analysis that's done on skulls can tell you where the quartz was mined, where it came from, whereabouts in the world it originates, which would rule out pretty fast if it was made from quartz that didn't come from South America. You'd know that it wasn't Aztec or Mayan or Olmec or whatever. You'd know pretty much straight away. But as far as I'm aware, it's not something that has been done on a big scale. I mean, there's something somebody could do, try to gather as many of these skulls together as possible and do a proper analysis. I do know the museums have done the micro surface analysis to have a look at manufacture, because most of them have come back claiming that the ones they have are machine made and they're from the beginning of the Victorian era. They all seem to have wheel marks and scratch marks on them. So I know that analysis has been done, but I don't think modern science has been focused on any number of the skulls. It's one of those things that I wrote the book for, because I thought, you know, there is a lot of unanswered questions here. We can take this further. So I would treat the book as a beginning, not an end in itself, more or less. So yeah, that's the answer, really.
Yeah. Now, I would believe, now maybe wrong, but I might be right, that quartz or any crystal, rock crystal, would be extremely hard to sculpt, much harder than marble. Do you know the comparison of the two as far as which is more difficult to sculpt?
Well, yeah, I've got a passing knowledge of geology. Excuse me a minute. Hang on, where is it there? Just don't want to deafen anybody. In geology, we have got a hardness scale, and I know that proper quartz, real seriously well-made silicon quartz, is extremely hard. It's not as hard as diamond or whatever, compressed carbon or whatnot, but it is extremely hard and it is very difficult to work. Hence the tool marks being a good indicator of, you know, what's going on. Because if there are marks in there, then they're going to be really hard to get rid of. Excuse me a minute.
Good thing for that mute button you have there. That's good.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so I understand. You know, as same with marble, sculpting marble, it has to be polished. A lot of times they polished. You know,
sorry,
Michelangelo used pumice and water, and he set you know, a 14-foot David sculpture. I can't imagine how long that took to, like, a year.
Yeah, it's a lot of polishing.
Very, very slow process. So yeah, this all fascinates me. When was the one of the two? You said there are two known, you know, really genuine. Was one of them in the Mayan ruins, and was it in a shaft tomb and some type of tomb of some type where they found it?
No, the one in Coba is set into the floor of the ballpark.
Oh, that's what you were talking about. Yes.
Yeah, that one, and that's life size, and it's white quartz, so it's milky. It's not clear, it's milky, and that is literally bang in the middle of the ball court. I'm not an enormous expert on the Aztecs and Mayans, but skulls, heads, play quite a large part in the Aztec ball game. So I'm assuming that's the reason why it's there, because it'll represent death. And it also represents the ball with the human head inside it, covered in rubber, that they used to play with. So that was probably one of the reasons why it's there. But that one is not widely known. Nobody's really made much mention of it, which is why I put it in the book. I don't think it's been excavated that long either, because the bit of Coba that it's in, they've only done about 10% of Coba. 90% of it's still covered in jungle and snakes and things. So the bit they've done hasn't been exposed that long, so I don't think that's been widely reported, the fact that that's there. The other one, the tiny one, which is, I think it's about yay big, I think it's about, I don't know, let's try and do this in centimeters, about 4 or 5 centimeters, I think it is. That's a clear quartz crystal skull. It's a proper one. And that came from Aztec ruins in just outside Mexico. Can't remember the exact village that it came from, but it was a site under excavation. So it was actually lifted out of the site by archaeologists. Now, potentially, that could have come from a ruined tomb. But the location, unfortunately, it's difficult to ascertain where that one came from because it's recorded. But there was a comment there was a comment passed when I was doing the research into the skulls. Somebody actually said to me, they said, I mean, this is not in the book, this is kind of off the record. I was speaking to somebody in the South American archaeological community, and they said, do you know what? They said, if we actually did start digging these things up, no, actually, no, his words were, if we actually had dug these things up, he said they would be national treasures and we certainly wouldn't be telling anybody.
Yeah.
So, you know, because they would disappear. You know, these things would be seriously valuable. So they don't usually mention it. If they turn up, they try not to say very much about it, really.
Yeah. Has anyone said, this is what I heard years ago, and it was after I told you that I saw this crystal skull up at the expo in Canada. But there was supposed to be some type of like mysterious things happen to the people that own them and things like that. Is there any stories like that?
Oh, there's loads, absolutely loads. My favourite is the British Museum one, because in the 1970s, apparently they had the skull on display, their skull, crystal skull, and it was in its own case. They had their own display case, and the security men kept packing in the job and leaving because they said the problem with this skull is that when we go in there at night, it not only does it watch us, follow us, and give us the creeps, but occasionally it glows blue.
Huh.
So you can imagine the British Museum are like, well, you know, we're a bit fed up with losing security guys here. I think perhaps the best thing to do is put shutters on the front of the case. So they ended up, they've got it now. I think they might still have it where the case actually shuts now. It closes at night with a remote. So it doesn't freak out the security guards. And that's quite common, you know. I mean, the one I've got, lots of people have handled it. And it does blow hot and cold. Some people pick it up and go, oh, this is lovely. It's gorgeous, you know. Please can I take this home with me? And then other people will pick it up and just go, whoa, just put it straight down again. So I'm sure that there's something about the way the skulls are made that affects human beings on a sort of physical, electrical, spiritual level. I think there's a dimension to them there as well, because they are really powerful objects. You know, they're primeval. You know, we're staring at something that stares back. You know, so there's definitely lots going on with them. But no, the British Museum is my favourite story. Yeah,
and I know that one. I do believe that one has machine marks of being 19th century. Correct?
Well, yeah. The argument is that. Very simply, the ones in Paris and the British Museum, they go back to a dealer who was selling Aztec and Mayan remains, selling bits and bobs from his shop. That's what he did. He sold South American stuff in Paris between, I think it was about 1820, 1830, up to about 1860. And he's a very famous guy for doing it. And he always sold it with paperwork, so you knew where these things were coming from. But the argument is that this guy sold, I think he sold about 4 or 5 of these skulls, and they were all sold from the same shop within the same period. At which point, you know, the detractors have all jumped on board and gone, well, it's quite obvious he's making them. But the defense, in his defense, nothing else that he ever sold was fake. None of it. And he's selling some amazing Aztec stuff. You're talking real gallery museum standard pieces that have been there, you know, forever. They've been in these museums now 150, 200 years, and he never sold fakes. So you look at these crystal skulls and you go, well, somebody had to make them, so maybe they're fake in terms of how old they're supposed to be. But that doesn't mean that they're not crystal skulls made from crystal that comes from South America, made by Aztecs or Mayans. So I think, personally, I like to think that the jury's still out on that one. I don't think that you can automatically say that these things are fake. I think one of them had the water content test I was talking about earlier performed on it, which can tell you how much water loss has gone from the surface of a stone object. And I have to say, I think it came back as being early 19th century. So whether or not the guy in the shop was fooled and, you know, sold a fake when he was out there buying the real stuff, I don't know. But it didn't seem to have more than about a 200-year-old pedigree. But again, you've got this argument, you know, where does reality and fakery stop and end? I mean, if it's Aztec, it's made from South American crystal. It's made by a Mayan or an Aztec, and it's, you know, it's done in the real way. And it you know, it ends up being life size, because that's another thing as well with these skulls. I'm very fussy with the definition. I think they need to be at least the size of a small child or bigger in order to qualify as being real. They've got to be life-sized. So when you start getting into the definitions, there's a blurred area, a grey area, which I think probably covers quite a few of the skulls that there are in museums. Till we find some way of doing a better job of dating them, I think we're going to have to be stuck with that as a way of looking at them.
You know, we have obviously we have a fascination with human heads. Yeah. You know, I mean, for us to do this, but it is kind of fascinating why
high technology. It'll stop me from coughing.
There you go. But it's the skull is kind of strange. You know, you'd almost think. I mean, I see a lot of times in, you know, I mentioned I'm an appraiser, and a lot of times I'll go in places and, you know, you see Buddha heads, but the Buddha heads, people don't realize this. You see them all over the place. They were knocked off. Those were full statues that were knocked. The heads are knocked off. Taken by tourists, and, you know, 100 years ago, and brought because they couldn't bring the whole statue back. They'd knock the heads off. But but you do see there is a fascination with heads in general. I mean, you do see that. It's kind of strange, but it's the prominent thing we're looking at when we're talking to each other. Yeah, I guess that's why it is. Yeah.
I mean, I occasionally get, well, in fact, all the time I get people bringing me things because, you're an archaeologist. You can date something if it's old. And then you get a lot of the bronze Buddhas and iron Buddha heads and whatnot. I mean, they still make them now. They make them in exactly the same way they used to. And they just go and bury them in a pile of dung for, like, you know, a few months.
That's exactly what they do.
And
they do that with iron too.
And they look like they're hundreds of years old.
That's right.
And they're not.
Yeah. I do a lot of work with that type of thing, and have to work with sometimes with experts that really know exactly what to look for. Yeah. Here's another question up here. This is not about the skulls itself. Is the fascination solely on the mystery of creation method, or is there some extra that people are claiming? Anything we can measure and replicate? I'm wondering if you saw, was that question may have come up when we were talking about the possibility of life changing, you know, as far as humans changing. Does this question make any sense to you? If not, I'll move on.
Mystery of creation method. Possibly it might be to do with creating the skulls even. Is there something else we can look at to be able to date the crystal skulls, which I think the answer is going to be this loss of fluid from stone. The rate at which it loses fluid will give you a rough idea of how much time the surface has been exposed. I think that's going to be the way ahead. So that kind of answers that.
So when you're talking about this fluid and it dissipating or whatever happens, well, you have a stone, a solid stone.
Yeah.
You're talking about after you cut the stone, that's when the moisture transfers?
Yes. I think there's a way. I don't do this process of analysis because it is just so new that it's something that's only just developing now. But I believe that by analysing the stone, in other words, what's inside it and how it's made and all the rest of it, they can get an idea of what the water content of that particular rock should be. And then what they do is they go to the surface of the rock, the actual worked areas, and look at what the water loss, the fluid content in that part of the stone has been. And somebody, some clever bright spark, has come up with a kind of a table of how long it takes for different stones with different content, water content, to basically dry out. So you can look at a surface and you can go, well, that's going to take 70 years for that to dry out, or it's going to take 200 years for that to dry out. And what they're doing there is they are getting some kind of ballpark figure as to how long that has been the way that it appears when we find it. I think originally it was done to identify things like Roman sculptures, medieval sculptures.
I see.
And as a means of appraisal, to try and decide if it's a fake or a real one. I mean, a fake would just register as still having the same water content as it had yesterday, because it wouldn't lose any. But if it's been exposed for, say, 2,000 years, it would be absolutely bone dry. The surface of it would not be in any way, shape or form the same as what's inside the stone itself. So I think that's, roughly speaking, that's how the analysis works. And I would see that as being the way forward for anything that's made of crystal.
I see. It would be nice if someday they could actually date things like the Sphinx and the pyramids to know exactly, how old they are. But again, those are stone. And
but I think geologically, the amount of damage that's on the Sphinx, and the way it's been reconstructed. As an archaeologist, I was quite convinced by the scenario that might have been sat there for 10,000 years, 10,500 years.
I think there's a lot of people with that in mind.
Yeah.
But of course, like you just mentioned, the face of it's probably been resculpted.
Oh yeah, it's definitely not. None of that Sphinx. I've actually stood next to it and I've touched it and I've photographed it and walked all the way around it, and it's what we call over here a Heinz 57. There's 57 different varieties of whatever, all stuck to that piece of rock. It's not now what it once was by any means. But the original bits, the bits that are still there from days gone by, are convincingly extremely old. And the pit that it sits in is also, all the sides of it are water damaged, and you can see there's a lot been going on, surrounding it, that it's been inflicted upon it, over time.
I wonder what's underneath that. That would be interesting.
Well, I managed to find two entrances. There's one between the pores behind the stone stele that's there. That disappears down the back and then vanishes into the front of the Sphinx. And then if you go all the way around the back, if you don't go on the side where the tail is, if you go on the other side, just forward of its back paw, there's a very distinct entrance there with a very worn set of almost inaccessible stairs that disappear down. And I believe from fellow archaeologists that there are chambers under there that eventually lead to a vertical shaft that has a black basalt coffin at the bottom of it.
Really?
Then it starts getting a bit woolly after that, because there's nothing in the coffin, and occasionally it floods, so it's not always easy to get to. But then some of people are saying that there are doorways that lead off, there are corridors that go off from that, and some people are saying that there aren't. But having seen what I've seen over the years, I would favour that there will be other entrances and other corridors underneath there. The whole of the Giza Plateau is basically like a Swiss cheese. It's just full of holes. It's crazy. I went riding across there on a horse. Somebody tried to get me on a camel. They said, you can ride across the Giza Plateau on a camel. I'm like, I'm not riding across that on a camel. No way. Have you ever seen how a camel walks?
Yeah.
And there's holes everywhere, and we're talking seriously big holes. Anyway, when we went off for the ride, they weren't laughing then, because I was fine. I'm there on my horse. I was going, hey, this is great. The horse is going in a straight line. Camels are all over the place. There's all these huge, enormous holes,
I don't know what I was thinking about when I said that I thought we could take calls, because we only have 10 minutes. I have an appointment. But I'm going to have you back on again, because this is way too fascinating for me. But and I'm not going to be able to take calls. I did tell everyone at the beginning of the hour that we'll touch a little bit on UFOs. I don't even know how UFOs could tie into anything at this point. We're pretty much stuck right in this run.
I mean, we seem to have used the book as a thread, so I'm going to do the same thing again while we've only got the 10 minutes left. I do say openly, I am a believer in unidentified flying objects. I have no problem with that whatsoever. In fact, I've got a piece of a crashed one in the garage here, which was given to me by a recovery team that actually recovered a case full. So there is actually out there somewhere, there's a DVD thing that I produced called Europe's Roswell, and that covers that particular crash in Wales.
I'm familiar. I remember hearing about that. So, I'm definitely going to have to be talking to you now after you just dropped that bombshell.
Well, I am very much a believer. And if you go back to the book, I do deal with the issue of extraterrestrial life and, coming in and out of our reality. I deal with that in the last chapter of the book called Alien Heads. But in my particular case, I've chosen to nail my colours to a slightly different mast, because as much as people think that these guys, come flying in and out of planet Earth from Venus and galaxies far away and this, that, and the other, nobody seems to have seriously looked at the issue of time travel. And I think certainly now in the 21st century, I think time travel and the way time operates, the way time functions, is going to become a fairly major issue. Now, obviously, as an archaeologist historian, time is something that's very, very close to my heart. So I finished the book off dealing with this issue of time. And these guys that are whizzing around in flying saucers and all the rest of it, I don't think time is a limitation to them. I don't think that they are linear in the same way that we are. And as soon as you start looking at things like that, some of these guys might actually be us from the distant past, or they might be us from the distant future. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, I want you, when we hang up, I want you to get on your computer and look up Dr. Michael Masters.
Oh, absolutely.
He's someone that's he's really been on this topic. He's a friend of the show. Yeah.
When you send me that white paper, just put a little note on it.
I sure will. Yeah.
Look up.
I'll have to do that tonight. But so this is, we have another question up here. I was going to try to get to all the questions, and we have about 7 minutes left. What is the scientific name of the species Homo sapiens evolved from? Getting back to that.
Wow. Well, we're Homo sapiens sapiens. That's what we are. So we are one of the species, and we can identify as clearly around about 43,000 BC. And believe it or not, I think it's Czech Republic, I think that comes from. There's excavations in the Czech Republic where they're getting these very, very human remains, which are very clearly us. And that's where they're coming from. So we are actually a prehistoric fossil species ourselves. But at that point, that's just happens to be the furthest they've got us back. They just haven't found anything before that. In terms of who we're linked to, as I say, they've isolated Neanderthal DNA in us. But then the other species, people like the Denisovians and the eastern species, of which there are two, the western species, and these others that they're coming up with, we don't seem to have that DNA in us. So it seems to be a sort of on the one hand, a fairly modern, fairly recent phenomena that we're here, but we must have origins. So it's a very good question. It's a really good question. I just don't think we again, as I said earlier on, we just don't have a fossil for that. It's not something we've been able to find yet. But certainly, I think the digs in the Czech Republic, they're ones to watch, because every so often they come out with, it started off at something like 32,000, then it went up to 38,000, then it went up to 40,000. I believe the last oldest remains they've got now is 43,000. And the other question as well, I should have mentioned it earlier because it's quite important, is if you end up with a fossil, and there's a lot of fossil skulls out there, there's loads of these fossils, the problem you've got is that it's made of stone. So you can't carbon date it, and you're not going to get any DNA out of it because it's fossilized. It's turned into a fossil. So it's a question that we're going to have a lot of trouble answering, to try and find out which one of all these different things we've got, which one fits us. So that is actually going to be a really difficult question to answer, a tough nut to crack, that one.
Yeah, here's a question I think is pretty interesting. Getting back to the skulls, can we replicate the creations method today on the more mysterious ones without tool marks? Now, I know there's high pressure water that cuts stone perfectly, and I'm not sure of other tools if we have those today to do something like that. Do you know?
It's a really good question, that, because I'm going to go back to the Mitchell Hedges skull, because the Mitchell Hedges skull is unique because the jawbone is separate. It separates away. So anatomically, it's probably the most accurate crystal skull we've got. It's also unique because that's the one that really doesn't have any manufacturing marks on it.
Is this it right here?
That's it. That's Mitchell Hedges. It's just a phenomenal piece of work. Personally, I think if that was in the possession of the Aztecs and Mayans, if they were using that as a religious object, people could literally sit there for hours and hours and hours and hours, using all different grades of abrasives to wear it away, to wear it down to what we've got now. And we know that they did that because there's a lot of prehistoric tools, there's loads of marble sculptures and whatnot in Egypt, there's lots of things all over the place that have been worn away using abrasives to create the finished product. Yeah. So that's a pretty good idea, pretty good suggestion that that's probably extremely old, because it would take quite a few generations to get it to where it is now. Also handling, I mean, over time, handling wears things away, just the grit and the grease and the dirt and the acid on your fingers. So that might be the last final finishing, if you like, on that skull, is the fact that it's been handled so much over time. That's the best answer I can give, really. I think most of them are polished that way. That one was just really, really well polished. Yeah.
No, you do see that, you know, it's like the worry stones, you know, how they wear down like that is kind of the thing when you're handling something. That's the same thing with what I do in the antiques realm. A lot of times you'll find things that you can just tell just by, you can take a look at it and say, oh yeah, this is a period piece because of the handling of it.
Well, the
things down.
The classic equivalent is prehistoric tools, because they're made from flint. Flint is silicon based. As an archaeologist, when I'm dealing with weird shaped, unusual prehistoric flint tools, usually they fall into the hand exactly in the right way that they were used. And when you look at where the fingers are making contact with the flint, you get highly polished wear marks because they've been used. So that is the classic process, really. That is the wear and tear on silicon that shines up the surface, that gives you the wear from use. So yeah, it's the same thing for us. We look for the same thing in archaeology.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and we'll have to have you back on. This is just too fun.
I'll be delighted. Absolutely delighted. Take this as an introduction. I'm more here to promote the book than anything else. But
and I'm going to have to talk to you about that crash stuff.
Oh, I'd love to cover that. I'd be delighted.
All right. You take care.
Take care.
All right, everyone. So that's it for the Everything Else show today. Remember, if you want to be getting notices for these shows, you just have to subscribe to this YouTube channel and click the little notification bell. Thanks a lot. And we will see you next time. I don't have a show scheduled at this point, but again, that's how you'll find out, is subscribing to the channel. Thanks again.